A Forgotten Past by Julio Rivas. The backstory which forged my future and new hopes. I was born in Chalatenango of El Salvador to my mother and my father, who in actuality was my uncle raising me in the city as its mayor. As I learned how to walk, I also was taught how to work from a young age. From this time, considered as my childhood, I worked with my mother not only tending to our chickens, pigs, and cows, but to the avocados and lemon trees we grew in the front of our home. The foods we ate were always fresh and natural, not to mention delicious. As I was also receiving a formal education, I eventually left my school in 6th grade to move to the capital, San Salvador, with my family, where I began to learn how to be a carpenter, among other talents. As I continued working, the country was slowly stirring towards something. By the age of 22, I noticed that what the country was moving towards was chaos, and I was in the calm before the storm. I was soon to be living in war. Ever since around 1970, the war slowly picked up until it fully blew up in 1980, where the guerrillas wished to overthrow the El Salvadorian government as they wanted to convert towards communism as Cuba had. The guerrilla group was known as FMLN, or Farabundo Marti Liberación Nacional, whose only wish to stop this government change and rule with the people. Even children were prepared to fight on both sides and throw away their innocence for victory. Life for me moved regularly, now that I was a driver for the government, in taking supplies to troops as well as to soldiers themselves to fight against the guerrillas. This war had blended in with everyday life, so seeing the bodies of dead men didn't surprise me. In this society, one wasn't faced to see conflict and war around us, and at the time, I was still taking care of my mother, who was already 68 years old at the time. It wouldn't be until 1985, the year of my mother's passing, that I eventually decided to leave the land of death for the land of freedom. As of 1985, my mother has now passed on into heaven, and I alone in my home, in the middle of the battlefield. I was still working as a driver for the military, bringing medical supplies even though the casualties are clearly seen through the land, where numerous bodies lay in decay, and the everlasting sounds of guns being fired off in the distance. I have grown tired of living in a place of conflict, where it shall never seem to resolve, only drag on until all of the country is only left without life. It is time when I have decided to leave, and I've heard that there is a land of freedom and peace up north, the United States of America. But in my current situation, I have no way of getting there, as my financial resources are limited. So I shall remain here and endure until my opportunity arises, like the coyote, the animal, and my way out. It's been 4 years since I've made the resolve to want to leave towards the land of freedom, and now my wish can come into fruition. I've met a man who works for El Coyote, who traffics people into the U.S. Before long, I knew there was a price for freedom, and I was willing to pay for it. At the cost of $3,500, El Coyote had his men transport me and a few others in buses from here to there. As I prepared to go, I had made some coffee from the beans we've always grown in the backyard. The aroma had enveloped my home, and this cup of coffee would be the toast towards my future, as I headed to meet up with one of El Coyote's men to head out. From here on out, my only goal was to escape, yet little to my knowledge, I'd only escape from one prison into another. And my trip, I was simply looking back at the home I was leaving behind, and looked towards my future. I can't say much of where I passed through, and what it was like all these years I've been alive. My memory isn't as good as it once was. Nevertheless, I know that the ride was bumpy, and the air was no longer stained with the blood of dead men. The sun was brighter, and everything just seemed to blend together, a mixed palette of colors. As the bus rode on, I noticed that the land we entered was much more cheerful, passing by people on beaches and buildings which were still intact. I eventually realized that from Guatemala we have long since left and entered into Mexico, where the midpoint resided in the beautiful city of Tijuana, not to mention the beautiful women in bikinis. In these 3 days, the feeling of time was convoluted. It felt as though it took a lifetime, and yet mere minutes. All that was left was passing the gates of the United States, not knowing the gates I would be passing through were behind bars. It wasn't long before we were passing the border from Mexico into the United States that the Immigration and Nationalization Services in San Diego, California had discovered that we were illegally entering, and my first day in this free land landed me behind bars. I was expecting to be sent back into El Salvador and the war grounds I grew accustomed to, but the federal agents let us go for 15 days, declaring that they would process our papers and grant citizenship, and that all we had to do was return to the facility. I wasn't an idiot. I knew they would only deport us back to our country and all my efforts would have been in vain. I knew I required help, so I escaped, heading east toward protection. My escape from San Diego, I began my journey by heading east, where I knew my niece was. I traveled across the country towards New York, only expecting to be assisted in getting documented. As I went through cities such as Salt Lake City in Utah and Chicago in Illinois, it took a span about a month or two before I finally arrived at the sides of New York. As I made my way from Wyoming into Albany, I eventually headed down into Manhattan, where I took the 7 train all the way to Flushing. It was the first time I used a mechanical train and what was called a MetroCard, a flimsy piece of plastic which somehow contained money, my money. From here on, I found a beacon of hope. From here on, it only took some minutes to find my niece's apartment building and her apartment 6J. As she opened the door, it wasn't to my knowledge at the time that she had also had another guest staying with her. It seemed that while I was taking care of my mother, my sister was also taking care of some of her own. It seems that not only did my sister have her daughter and son to take care of, but she had also been raising 2 sisters whose parents had abandoned them when they were younger. The younger of the 2 eventually came to the U.S. with my niece and hit the exact opposite side of the country in New York. As I saw this woman, I was distracted by her mesmerizing beauty and nearly forgot why I arrived here before remembering to ask my niece for assistance. For now, I must lay low, but I'll also ask this woman out. It might allow me to start a new beginning. It's been 3 years since I arrived at those doorsteps for assistance, and after all that time, I've come to love the guest, this woman, with my very soul. It didn't take long from the day I got in New York to grow fond of her and likewise for her towards me. In only a year I had proposed to her to where she had this radiant smile, only being covered by her hands in a mixture of shock and joy. These past 2 years have flown by, and it is now our day to be joined as one under God in holy matrimony. I found it to my surprise as we were dating. She informed me that marriage with a legal citizen could grant one residency. I married this angel because I loved her, but as of now, one may say that I'm killing 2 birds with 1 stone. Although she is in heaven, it feels nice telling my past to my son, who is making it into this. This is the end of the beginning of my father's past.